Hello, today we're going to go back to the world of movies. Now, the video I did about Napoleon and talking more generally about the accuracy and the problems of how a lot of film producers and directors approach the past in ways that we history buffs don't particularly like, but they have reasons and agendas of their own, seems to have got a reasonable amount of attention. It certainly provoked some impassioned and well-argued and reasoned, as well as just the simple subjective reactions of, well, I don't like it or I do like it responses. So I thought I'd continue talking about some films. Mainly we're going to talk about movies and TV dramas set in the ancient world, and particularly the Roman era, with a particular emphasis on those that portray the Roman army and, to a slightly lesser extent, Roman politics. Now, there are lots of other ones, and I will fairly soon do a little talk about Gladiator, given that, again, Ridley Scott seems to provoke all sorts of quite strong pro and against reactions. And also because it's interesting, because that battle scene at the start is one of the largest scale attempts to show the Roman army in relatively recent years. And of course we've got Gladiator 2 to come out, I'm not sure if that's in 2020, late 24 or even in 25. I think they're completing it at the moment. So we can look at how that same director dealt with a different historical era and the similarities and differences with that film. But I thought for the start of these, for the first one, we'd actually go back a little bit in time. And we're going to the 1960 Spartacus production, obviously starring Kirk Douglas in the lead role, but also, you've got Tony Curtis, Gene Simmons, you've got Laurence Olivier, Charles Laughton, Peter Ustinov. It's a pretty stellar cast in one of those big, lavish Hollywood epics that rarely get made. And there's an element where significant differences in stories and presentation, all that sort of thing, but that type of budget film is quite a rarity. But Napoleon to some extent fits into that. It's taking something from the past with quite a degree of license, to put it mildly, and then making a story that is supposed to be big, is supposed to be spectacular. And this is, Napoleon's a little bit of a complicated one because obviously there's Apple funding in it. It's going to end up on a streaming service and seen on people's TVs. The old epics were very much designed for the cinema. They've been shown umpteen times. I grew up watching them. It's one of the reasons why I became so enthusiastic about the ancient world and the Romans, was the inspiration of the scenes in some of these epics. All helped to fuel my imagination. So there's an element where it's spectacle for the sake of spectacle. And that goes back to some of the very old Hollywood traditions and all the silent epics and that sort of thing. This idea of let's make something big that people haven't seen before, or that surpasses anything. And occasionally you get eras where films do that. I suppose for my generation, seeing the original Star Wars films, that was something different. We hadn't seen anything like that in the cinema before. You could say the Lord of the Rings films had a similar aspect. There was an element where the effects, the new methods of filmmaking came together. Somebody had the budget and time. They did 3 films out of one, a trilogy or one book, depending on how you interpret how it works and what Tolkien's intentions were. More to do with the publishers that end up as 3 books. That was different. You hadn't quite seen that. And then anything that follows, even using the same techniques, has got to go better. It's a bit like Roman triumphs we've talked about in some of the other things. If you want to be the most spectacular, the most grand, the most epic film, then you're not just competing with yourself, you're competing with all the other ones that have come before. So to do something different and bigger and better and more impressive becomes harder and harder as each new achievement, each new great spectacle is made. But I thought we'd go back to some older epics first, or this one particularly, because there's one very powerful, very grand battle scene in the Spartacus movie, and it's interesting in the way it presents the Roman army, less to do with how the Roman army actually did things, but how people think about the Romans, how people think about battles in the ancient world. And we'll look a lot at battle scenes in the talks to come, and we'll see some of the themes that are illustrated in this one will come up again and again and again, and some of them will be in films that are earlier. It didn't all start with Spartacus, but it's just an interesting topic. And it was something I remember. Again, this is one of the few of these older films that I've actually seen in the cinema, because they re-released it with a slightly extended version back, I don't know, was it 10, 15 years ago? Probably more. But I remember going out and seeing it, and there is something about that huge screen, and it does bring to life this cast of thousands that you have in some of these older movies, and this was the stage where it was, on the whole, actually people, not computer-generated rank and file that fill in the gaps and make things more spectacular. So they behave rather differently, because they had to be marshalled in a way by people working for the director that with CGI you can just control them with a click of a mouse. I mean, it's obviously a lot more complicated than that, but nevertheless, it has a different effect. It is harder to get CGI to look real, but then one of the problems is that most of us have never seen these numbers of people, particularly these numbers of people deploying in formation, let alone trying to fight a battle. Now, this is an alien experience. This is something no one has seen, close formations of infantry clashing on the battlefield. And there aren't many good descriptions, even from the periods when this happened, because everybody then, either they'd seen it, so they'd seen the elephant, they knew what it looked like, or they were trying to describe it to someone who hadn't seen it. That's always a very difficult thing to do. So let's start with the film. It was released in 1960. Not going to go into great history of the production and the cast and all this sort of thing. There are plenty of podcasts and talks and YouTube channels that do the film stuff, that do both the theory but also just the analysis, the criticism. When you get comments on this, it's going to be very much subjective from my point of view, whether I quite like it or I don't like it, or whatever. And when we look at the history, it's not going to be just a catalogue of, well, that detail's wrong, that detail's wrong, that sort of thing. We'll say a bit about that, because the way people are presented can be quite interesting, because it does shape the way, popular is perhaps the wrong word, but many people will imagine the Romans and the Roman world and slaves and gladiators and all these things, and Roman legionaries. There's an element, we'll do another short talk that'll come up in the next few days about the little Syracuse scenes in the Indiana Jones film, where again you've got Romans that they've made some effort, but there's elements where they have to look like Romans that the audience will recognize as Romans. So all the representations pile on one on top of another, which means if something's a bit dodgy at the start, it tends to get repeated, because that becomes the symbolism of, if you show someone who looks like that, then everybody in the audience says, yes, that's a Roman legionary, I know what's going on. But that's for another one, and we'll just do that in a few, probably be up in a few days' time, I should think, something like that. I haven't quite completed that one yet. So we'll go back to Spartacus. Most of the filming, I believe, was done in 1959. Some of the grand battle scenes were done in Spain with the assistance of the Spanish army. General Franco was willing to hire them out to Hollywood, and that explains how some of the things are done in the way they're done. So that, but I think most of the rest of the filming was largely in California, but certainly in the United States. So they seem to gel together reasonably well. It's a plausible enough. The landscapes look reasonably Italian. There's a sense of that grandeur. The look is okay. The film was based on the 1951 novel Spartacus by HYoward Fast. Now, if you haven't read it, it's well worth digging out and finding and giving it a read. It's obviously got strong overtones of the author's own experiences. He was imprisoned for a while because he wouldn't provide a list of people who'd taken part in a charity for former Republican soldiers and their families who'd fled from Spain after the Civil War into France. It's that reaction from the 1930s, the Republican cause being frightfully fashionable with a lot of people in the West, to the sudden early days of the Cold War, when communism didn't sound like such a great idea and seemed a threat more than a sort of great inspiring cause. So there's clearly that, and this is someone who is a novelist and a very accomplished novelist, but not an aged historian by training. And he talks about, I read in the introduction to the edition that I read, he talked about learning Latin to some degree for them, studying as his research for writing the book. And he's also got a rather interesting comment, which perhaps I should take to heart sometimes. So I'll just read this out for you. This It's funny, he actually attributes this quote to Crassus in the character, and he says that, no, indeed, two things all men are convinced they have a talent for, with neither preparation nor study involved. Writing a book and leading an army. With good reasons, and such an amazing number of idiots get to do both. I refer to myself, of course, he added disarmingly. So I suppose nobody's ever obviously going to get me to control an army. And when I was in the OTC at Oxford, our training was basically at platoon level to some extent. They were explained how a company might work, but I was just an officer cadet. I didn't get to do much of this in a practical sense, even though I was taught the theory. So I'm certainly not commanding an army, but I have, as life has turned out, written a lot of books, and I certainly intend to go on writing more, because writing is terribly addictive. But you get those little digs that are quite nice as an author. You see someone who's a little bit jaundiced about some of the stuff that clearly they don't like, they see out there. However, the main thing is, it's an interesting novel, and it's well worth a read. He doesn't really get the hang of Roman names, particularly for the 1st century BC, so the names are a little bit all over the place and all sorts of oddities crop up. And many of his assumptions about how the Roman state work, probably as a historian I wouldn't go along with, but it's not bad. And given that he is trying to understand this slave-owning culture, the growing political tension in the 1st century BC, and the reasons why you could have this revolt by gladiators that turns into a large-scale revolt by slaves, but also, it's quite insightful. He points out at the end that actually most slaves didn't join Spartacus, and that there were never, he claims in the story, there were never as many as in the slave army as the Romans boasted. So it's an interesting book. It's well worth a read, and it's very different in many ways to the story, and partly that's because most of the novel is told in flashback. It focuses very much on a group of Roman characters that include Crassus, include the orator Cicero, still a relatively young man at this point. Fast clearly does not like Cicero very much and didn't take to him. And the character as portrayed is a pretty cynical, nasty piece of work. Again, I can understand where he gets that from. I'm not sure I quite go as far as that in my view of the man. I have a bit of sympathy for him. That's perhaps comes from studying him, and when you read a lot of Cicero, he sort of gets into your head after a while. Back when I was an undergraduate in my final year, did a lot of Cicero then. It was the only time in my life I ever vaguely considered politics as a career, because when you get this voice whispering in the back of your head about your duty to the state and the concord of the orders and all this sort of thing, it gets to you. But thankfully I wised up and I didn't do anything like that. So you have Cicero, you have other fictional characters, you have some of the people with the same name that will turn up in the film, but and some of them are real, like Titus, the Lannister, the gladiator trainer that's played by Peter Ustinov in the film. He is portrayed rather differently in the book. Gracchus, broadly, it comes sort of round to the Charles Lawton character later on near the end, and there's elements of that are quite similar, but there's a lot that's different. And so it would be very hard as a narrative structure, particularly the way films tend to work then. This was before the sort of streaming Netflix type drama where everything seems to be 3 hours before, 3 weeks before, then back, and you're jumping around in time. In that, trying to confuse the viewer enough, but not too much, so that they still know what's going on and can follow the story, and they're intrigued rather than just baffled by the whole experience. But, you get a lot of jumping around in TV drama in recent years. It tends to be a feature, a technique that's used quite often but wasn't in the old epics. So you come to the film, which has again a script written by a man who'd been blacklisted. Again, it's this same political context in the States, and this was a big deal at the time. The story in the film is more simply chronological. You begin with Spartacus is a slave. Kirk Douglas is there in the mines I think he's in Egypt in the book, whereas they make it Libya in the story, but I mean, it's not really a big deal. And Peter Ustinov himself goes out to find him rather than sending an agent and all this sort of thing. But you have from the start, you have the story of the slave. You get some sense of just how appalling the treatment of slaves could be, and how casually it was accepted by everybody. I mean, that's a big theme both in the book but also in the film. How you're simply used to this, you're accepting it as normal. They are only slaves. They are only gladiators. You know, they are not fully human. That's developed even more in the book. He goes to Italy, he's trained, he meets Verinia Jean Simmons. You have that. She becomes a British slave, she's a German slave in the book, and I think that was to do with when they casted Simmons, and I think I believe she replaced another actress. So the whole thing is rather well done. The scenes in the gladiatorial school are quite interesting. A lot of it is invented, deduced as to how they might have done these things, because we don't have too much information, and you know, our information about gladiators is dotted around different centuries, although there's a tendency to ram it all together and make one nice big simple jigsaw out of it. That's probably, as with anything else in the Roman world, to be resisted to a degree. Things may well have changed, they may well have varied from area to area. The underground areas of the sets they used for the gladiatorial training school, interestingly enough, are inspired by the underground complex at the amphitheatre at Puteoli, which is Bay of Naples, not too far from Pompeii, Herculaneum, modern-day Pozzoli. And if you're ever in the area and get the time, visit the amphitheatre, because it's like a sort of mini Colosseum. You know, it's still big and impressive, but it's very much the same design. It's that pattern. You can see the trapdoors, or where they were, in the arena, and underneath them the traces of where the pulley system was to lift things up, just as they in fact do in a couple of the scenes in Gladiator, where things could be lifted up onto stage, onto the arena, in or during the course of a fight. But also, if you look at these, you can see from these pictures, there's that brickwork, there's that sense of these arches. You can see how it's inspired. It is quite impressive. It gives this very grim view, but it does have a slightly alien feel. You know, it's not a building that we just see, oh yeah, that's just a building and they happen to have gladiators in it. It makes it look a little bit different. It makes it look a bit more sinister. And it's interesting, again, as with a lot of these things, considerable research was done with what was available, but as is always the case, then various decisions are made. The research isn't always the latest information. Much of our information about how particularly the Roman soldiers looked in that era has developed greatly since the 1950s. So there are reasons why they do things the way they did, and some of it they may have thought they were getting absolutely right. It's just that's now we reckon that's not the case. We're pretty sure it's definitely not the case, and this is how we think it is. But again, you know, more may be learned as time goes on. But it's quite nice that they did take this real archaeological site and they used that to try and create this set from it. So you get that quite often in movies in general, where they'll take something and then they'll expand it into a set, a prop, a costume that is of use for them. And depending on how far they develop it, it might end up being barely related at all to anything in the ancient world, or it might actually be something that, yeah, that could work, that could be quite nice. So you then have, you start to develop the Roman characters, and this comes back to a basic problem with telling this story. Obviously, from the point of view of the ancient sources, everything's told by the Romans. Well, it normally is, or the Greeks and the Romans. Much of it's written considerably later. Quite a bit of the evidence for the rising comes from Plutarch and from Appian, both writing in the early 2nd century AD. So, you know, 1 3/4 centuries afterwards is a long time, a long gap. And the probability is that many of the details of how the slaves behaved, how they debated, what they decided, were never known by outsiders because of the treatment of the slaves subsequently. And this makes it, you know, both in the novel and in the film, Spartacus is the descendant of slaves. You know, he's only ever known slavery. Appian preserves a tradition that he'd actually been enslaved as an adult, that he'd served as an ally, as an auxiliary perhaps, with the Roman army at some point. Now that could just be the sort of rumour that the Romans liked, that the only people who could beat us, the only people who were dangerous opponents, were ones we trained ourselves. You know, it's a theme you get again and again. It's obviously people like Arminius and Civilis and Tacfarinas in North Africa. I talked about him in the raiding talk a while ago. So you never quite know, is there some truth to that? Well, possibly. People did get enslaved as adults as a result of conflict and debt. Or is it simply Roman snobbery? The big problem, though, that both the novelist and the filmmakers have is that the slaves are hard to develop as characters and make interesting because we desperately want them to win. We probably know, if we've got any sense of history, that they can't win, that it's all going to turn out, it's going to end in defeat, it's going to end in executions, it's going to end in a grim result of all of this because the Roman Republic doesn't fall, or at least it doesn't fall to Spartacus' enslaved army, and the Roman Empire is going to go on for so many more centuries. And although in many parts of the empire there will be considerably less emphasis on slaves as a labour force compared to 1st century BC Italy, nevertheless slavery will remain as a feature throughout the Roman Empire, and it will continue in very many societies for a very long time afterwards, though it will develop in its form and its nature. So we know the slaves can't win, and we also, we admire them naturally and we like them, but they don't really get a chance to do very much. There's not much friction between the characters. You have little or no argument. There's a little bit when in the film they capture some Romans and the other former gladiators are making them fight in the arena, and Spartacus stops them because he won't do that. You get a little bit of character development when it's, you have Woody Strode, who's always impressive and rather a scene stealer in his films. That's partly because I like John Ford Westerns and the like, but you have that when Kirk Douglas is trying to be friendly to him and he says, gladiators don't have friends, I might meet you in the arena and I might have to kill you. So you get moments where you get, if anything, the most interesting bits with the slaves are while they're still slaves. And that tension, that dreadful life they're living, and the danger, when Gene Simmons is brought to Spartacus as, to share his bed, and Peter Ustinov and the trainer are sort of leering through the up above the window into his cell. They're just treating them like animals, treating them like entertainment. These things are powerful and they work very well, and that relationship works well, and the friction between them. It is harder once they've rebelled, once they've got their freedom and they're just trying to survive and do the right thing. I've read, and I don't know whether this is true or not, that other battle scenes had been scripted, possibly even filmed, where the slaves get to win. Because you have the marvellous scene of the breakout, which is very, very well done. It's great cinema, the way they take the fence that they've has been fencing them in, they break it down and they use it as a sort of ladder up to climb up and escape and fight their way through. They use it as a weapon against the guards. It's all good dramatic stuff. It's well done, but you don't after that, and then you see them in the aftermath when they've defeated Glabrus and the cohorts from Rome and wiped them out, but you see the camp burning after the victory. You don't see them creeping into the camp, getting past the sentries, slaughtering the Romans. And you don't see the other victories. You see the slaves marching in triumph through cities after they've won, but you don't actually see them. You hear about them. It's all off stage, basically, this occurs. And I don't know whether these scenes were made. From what I read, it was more to do with pacing, with space, and also a concern as to, do you want rebels being shown being glorious and winning? I'm not so sure about that. I suspect it had far more to do with... There is a problem with battle scenes that they can become repetitive if they're rather samey. How do you make them look different? And while the sort of eager military historian might like to see lots of different things, and okay, how are you going to represent this? How are you going to make them win this time? The perception is that the wider audience might simply get confused or bored by this. But anyway, they're not there. There is relatively little fighting in this film that you actually see on screen. And you have the gladiatorial bouts when Kirk Douglas does get to fight Woody Strode, but before that Crixus has fought another gladiator, and you only see that as they're glimpsing it. They're waiting in that little chamber to go on for their own time to fight, and you sort of hear the noises and you see it through the gaps between the slats of the fence. And it's a really nice scene. It's very powerful, and you're looking at their reaction, and they know they're next, and they know that someone they know is about to die. Just for the whim of some spoiled Roman aristocrats. And again, you've got which is also in the the book, but it's done slightly differently there, but similar, where Woody Strode defeats Kirk Douglas but doesn't kill him, and instead tries to attack the Romans but gets killed before he can reach them, and he's finished off by Laurence Olivier's Crassus. It's good stuff. There are the fights that they have are very well done. Those two particularly in the gladiatorial school, both the gladiatorial fights and then the breakout. And then, as I say, you don't get very much. But the focus, when the film really comes alive, tends to be rather like the novel. It's actually with the Roman characters, who are villains, but villains to a degree. You know, they are. I saw an interview with Peter Ustinov in the aftermath of the film that he likes to play people who are complicated. They're not simply bad in every respect. That Batiatus, the Lannister he plays, has this sort of inner sense of what's right and eventually gives into it and starts to behave better. But the point is, the Romans get the funny lines. And I went years ago to see a one-man show Peter Ustinov gave, and he talked a little bit about the film and the competitiveness between Charles Laughton and Laurence Olivier. It comes across, they come across as rivals. They're made to be political rivals. This Gracchus character is a creation, and he's a sort of odd mixture. It's no coincidence that this same theme will be picked up with the same name, in this case with Derek Jacobi in Gladiator. It's how these elements that appear in films or television tend to get taken up by the screenwriters of the next generation and reused and adapted, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. In that case, you have this bloke talking about trying to restore the Republic and end the rule of emperors in the late 2nd century AD. Not a very likely thing. In this case, you have, presumably he's supposed to be an echo of the Gracchi, the brothers who'd been tribunes and had both died violent deaths in the later 2nd century BC. It's not entirely clear. The political situation is exaggerated to the point where you have a sort of dictatorship takeover by Crassus at the end of the film, not in the way that happened. All that Crassus does is stand for the consulship at the end of the film with Pompey. Now, he hasn't demobilized his army before he does this. He stands for election whilst outside the city. It's what Julius Caesar wanted to do in 49 BC and isn't allowed to, and leads to a civil war then. But it anticipates all of that. Caesar, of course, features in the film. He's not in the book, not to any degree anyway. And he's there as the sort of the next rival that Laurence Olivier Crassus comes on. Again, there's a lot of confusion. The patricians have sort of become synonymous with senators. It's all a little bit, the Roman politics is interesting, but it's very much a caricature, with lots of things that are more about modern politics or how we assume states should work, rather than necessarily the Republic of that day. Although it's quite nice when you have Charles Laughton as Gracchus going around buying things from market stalls, talking to people, making sure he introduces everyone by name, being cynical about state religion, or I'll make a sacrifice. Of course, I don't believe in it privately, but publicly I'll do everything I can. That's interesting. There's an element of that face-to-face content. The Senate meetings they have, indeed the Rome they have, is a little bit too grand for Rome in the 70s BC. A lot of the monuments have not yet been built. People like Pompey and Caesar haven't started to commemorate their monuments, their achievements with these big monuments in the centre of Rome, let alone you haven't got to Augustus, and there's complete remodelling of the city, the finding it brick, leaving it marble stuff. The problem is that for Hollywood, when we show an ancient city, particularly Rome, it's got to look gleaming white marble, it's got to look grand, it's got to have columns, it's got to have big temples, it's got to have big monuments, because that's what we associate the Romans with. So it's probably always going to be that way. One of the things about the HBO Rome series I quite liked was the set, which gave a grubbier look, particularly to the back streets and that sort of thing. But we'll come on to that series in another talk at some point when we get around to it. There's lots of material for these talks about film and television and history, and particularly the Romans. You have the Senate meetings where, bear in mind, the Senate is supposed to be about 300 strong this time, near enough. This is, it's 600 strong. This is after Sulla's reform. So there are a lot of senators out there. Quite a few would be out in the provinces at any one time. Some would be at their estates and not attending debates, but nevertheless, it's bigger than the group you see. It's It's quite well done. I mean, again, there wasn't, the Senate didn't necessarily meet in the Curia at this time. It would meet in different locations depending on the occasion. But it's quite nice. You've got lictors with their fasces. You've got a presiding magistrate in his curul chair. It's quite nicely done. The debates there, they have a sense of applause. They don't do the pedari, the walking towards each other when you're supporting someone's viewpoint. But again, it's manageable within the frame of, if you tried to show, let's say, 300 to 400 people, assuming that others are away or not bothering to come to Rome, that becomes a huge group and a very different sense, and you're likely to want a more raucous feeling about it, more sort of House of Commons here in the UK with its childish behaviour rather than the more sedate American political style of debate. And you get in other assemblies as well. That's just the first one I thought of. But it's quite nice. But it's the Romans that come alive. And this was true in the book as well. It's probably why Fast spent most of his time with the Romans. And it's all about how the Romans deal with what's just happened. One of the constant themes is these are groups of people travelling along the Appian Way and seeing all the crucified slaves. And, how do they react to that? Do they react to it at all? How do they treat these fellow human beings? So there's lots of interesting ideas in the novel, which you get to some extent in the film, but obviously the film doesn't have the time and space and can't do the inner thoughts in the same way. But Peter Ustinov makes us laugh. So does Charles Laughton. Laurence Olivier is that dramatic. He does have that sense of this powerful statesman. Again, this is perhaps not quite reflective of Crassus at the time. He's portrayed as a general, which, okay, he's fought in the Civil War and he's done well there, doesn't feel he's got the credit, but it's a theme that we'll come back to again and again when we look at these things. When writers come to the Roman world today, they assume a very modern Western perspective whereby you are either a politician or a soldier. And the Roman combination of the two, with the emphasis on the politician, but you sometimes go off and lead armies in war, and that's a big part of your political success, your glory, your credit. We struggle with that. We can't really imagine a situation where somebody gets elected to office and then put in charge of 20,000 men and told to go off and fight a war or govern a province without very much experience, and certainly without formal training to do this. That's not our world. We assume soldiers are professional. And this, you get this again and again and again. The Russell Crowe character in Gladiator is the soldier who doesn't understand politics, is supposed never even to have been to Rome. So we create this division that's rather artificial, and but on the other hand, it's good in the way you represent. Crassus is how he's presented as making speeches, even when he's just privately, is quite like the rhetoric infused the life of a Roman aristocrat. You feel these people were performing nearly all the time because that's their life. And Charles Laughton as well, the way he manipulates the Senate debates and makes people laugh, but also argues them around. It's nicely done. It gives a sense of this political life, this political competition, that the Romans are, on the one hand, all accepting of slavery, but actually some of them are worse than others. So it's degrees. Crassus is really the villain. He is the nastiest of them all, but also the weakest, the most vulnerable because of the end with Verinia. So you have that, and it's nicely done. And Peter Ustinov told a story about how Laurence Olivier had done his research, discovered that the Romans didn't have stirrups, and as far as he knew, didn't have saddles, because this was before Peter Connolly had come along and reconstructed the Roman saddle. So that he insisted on riding bareback, or bareback with maybe just a blanket, throughout the film, and that sometimes he was sort of struggling as the horse was wriggling under him. As someone who's always happier with stirrups myself, I've done some bareback, and I know if you're a better rider than I am, this can be natural and fine. But I've done it. I can do it. It's okay. It's to me less comfortable, probably because I'm just that little bit nervous, and I'm happier with that support. Interestingly enough, rewatching it recently, I noticed that in one or two scenes Kirk Douglas also rides without stirrups. But in all the critical ones, particularly the battle scenes or anything like that, everybody's got stirrups. That's probably a safety issue, because it's much harder to get enough really good riders who can ride safely and successfully without them, and also do all the things that the film director requires them to do, ideally on the first take, because time is money. So that's quite interesting, and I think it works. And that sense of, that marvelous voice and the modulation that Olivier possessed, it does give Crassus this extra thing. He has this couple of scenes with Tony Curtis as Antoninus. This is a character that's not in the novel, and to some extent fills the role of the Jewish gladiator David in the story, who in many ways is more interesting as a character, but also most of the things that make him interesting are actually sort of internal. It's his thoughts, it's his former experience. But he is, in the book, he's the last gladiator left. He's the one who fights not against Spartacus, who's been killed in the battle and his body never identified, chopped to pieces, which again is part of the tradition of the ancient sources. You can understand Hollywood, the star wants to be right at the end, and it does make for a powerful scene. The Tony Curtis character, again, it's one of the ones where the slaves don't come to life very well. They don't get to do much in the time when they're rebels. They're mostly moving the plot along, saying, well, we're going here, they're looking at a map, we can't go this way, we'll get trapped, the Cilician pirates will carry us away, oh no, they've been bribed by Crassus, they won't come, they won't take us. You see the affection growing between the characters, but they don't get to do it, whereas the Romans get to do all the dramatic stuff. And it is, it's so often true that the villains, or the dodgier a hero or heroine is, the more interesting they can be on screen. So, even to the sort of James Bond thing, he's probably not someone you'd like to have around, but he's interesting to watch. And often you get the sort of the very stylish, the very witty, but rather vicious hitman can be quite a figure in series and films and works very well, even though this person is pretty vile. Nevertheless, they make us laugh, they amuse us, and because they do that, we rather take to them. We rather like them, at least long enough to be interested in what they're doing. And the Romans work that way. They are just more interesting than the slaves in this film. I don't think that's just me as someone who studied the Romans more. I think it's the way it works, and the cast, those performances. You've got these three British character actors who are scene stealers at the best of times. And they work very well with each other. But interestingly enough, whilst you have those three, most of the other Romans are played by American actors. So you don't have that tradition you got in some of the epics where Roman basically equals British, and almost the Roman Empire was represented as a sort of Englishman in togas, basically, or Victorian Englishman. It was almost like the British Empire just transferred back, which is another interesting thing to talk about, but perhaps another day. As anybody who's sat through any of these talks so far will realise, particularly when I'm not following one of the lectures, I do tend to digress, I do tend to ramble rather a bit. For anybody British or perhaps Commonwealth of a certain age, I'm afraid my lecturing style probably owes more to Ronnie Corbett's joke-telling than any more methodical and efficient way of imparting argument, and certainly I don't think Cicero would approve of my rambling. But it's the way that's natural, and my idea behind this channel and these talks is to make this as normal. The idea is we're having a chat, and I'm afraid the rest of you can't talk back to me other than in the comments. That's the nature of the thing, but it's supposed to be very casual, friendly, and this is how I bore people rigid when they have the misfortune to get stuck next to me at a party. So this is easiest for me to do, and I can do this in time because I don't have to script it. This is just chatting. It's just natural. And in the course of next year, I'm hoping to, or actually by the time this video comes out, it will probably be this year, I'm trying to bully and bribe and persuade various friends to come on, and we'll do some talks so that I can talk about why other people have got interested in ancient history, archaeology, this sort of thing, some of the work they're doing, some of the things they're writing. And as far as possible, we'll try to do that less as an interview and more of a friendly chat. Basically we're all gathering around over a cup of tea or coffee or whatever it might be, and just talking about the things that interest us, and trying to explain why we enjoy these things, why it's so intriguing, it's so fascinating. Anyway, digression over. Let's move on to the big battle scene, which, as I say, is mainly why I chose this film to start off this series of talks. This was filmed in Spain, and it's got the Spanish army as extras, so a lot of these conscripts get to serve in the slave war, and it shows, and it's a very powerful piece of cinema. And I'm not quite sure about the copyright issue when it comes to taking clips, so we'll just go with a few stills. But you have the slave army is deployed up on the ridge. No formation, no organisation, just a big crowd. There's lots of them. This is very much cast of thousands Hollywood spectacle. We've got tons of people and we've dressed them up, we've costumed them. It's what they look like. The close-ups you get because they're waiting in silence. Great discipline, they're just standing there waiting and knowing the sense that they've got other Roman armies approaching, that they're in trouble. You know, this is not what they wanted. They've got to fight Crassus because he's bribed the Cilician pirates not to carry them away to safety. Again, not a theme, not something from the novel. This is in the film. So you have them waiting, and as you pan along, you get close-ups of little groups. You've got the elderly, you've got women, everybody's armed, all the slaves are coming together. These are human beings fighting for their freedom. It's, you know, it's a very basic emotional appeal to us that we know these people deserve to be. They shouldn't be slaves. We know slavery is wrong. We know they've been badly treated. We know the Romans are terrible. And generally, it's one of the striking things. It probably reflects the extras that are available. You don't get, in the book, there's emphasis on lots of Gauls and Germans amongst, as well as the Thracians, as well as the Africans, as well as the Syrians, as well as the Jews, as well as the Thracians. Most people are dark-haired in this, and that probably, I suspect, in the big battle, as you're doing it in Spain, that reflects the extras you've got available. But even in the other scenes, there aren't many, you know, Crixus is dark-haired. You don't get a sort of red-faced Gaul, as it were, which again, fine, no problem. Not all Gauls were the stereotype of the big blonde that the Romans imagine. But it's just, it gives it a certain look. It gives it, along with the very drab clothes, the slaves wear. They're always muted colours. They're meant to look sort of fairly cheap. It gives it this sort of a feel to the whole group, but it also means you can identify them. That's a slave, and when you see the Roman soldiers, those are Roman soldiers. You know exactly who's who in this sort of simple imagery. So the slaves are waiting, and this is a long scene. I remember I used to use this as a video clip sometimes in a talk I gave about how to command a Roman army, which is something I'll probably redo for this channel at some point again. I get around to it. The first few times I did it, I forgot just how long this scene was, and I was running out of time in my usual way of rambling on, and then there's a whole lot of them just standing there staring, looking nervous, looking tense, but also looking determined, whether it's Kirk Douglas, whether it's our main characters, whether it's lots of extras. And then the Romans appear, and you hear this, it's a mix of music. You've got trumpets, you've got some drums, there's this rhythmic clash of metal, of weapons, and I don't think it's the sound the extras are actually making. It's probably dubbed on, but it's very effective. The Romans come marching in step in, you know, by Hollywood standards in particular, perfect formation, and they come over a ridge, and they appear as, first of all, I think it's supposed to be 2 legions. You have 10 formations within them. There's a couple in the front, then 3, then 3, then 2. So it's not quite the triplex achies of the commonest formation, but again, by this period, not the only formation that the Romans use. And again, that's a talk for another time. But it's an attempt to do that. They're in checkerboard. There are these big blocks of men there. They're too big to be maniples. They're presumably meant to be cohorts, I suppose 10 cohorts in a legion. That's probably what they're going for. And they march across. They're in these big, dense squares, really, or rectangles. Not the relatively shallow fighting formations that there's better evidence for the Romans actually using. But again, this is an advance over a considerable distance. Slaves stay exactly where they are. They just wait, and you keep cutting back from one to the other. Crassus and his officers, his standard bearers, are up there on a sort of little rocky knoll, watching this go past. Now, I don't know. I rather suspect that Laurence Olivier wasn't present for the filming of the battle scenes. Because he doesn't do anything, and all the scenes you see of him, you never see him and a large number of extras at the same time, in the same frame. Behind him you just see things, so it might well be that he wasn't there. I don't know, that's speculation. He does nothing. The Roman army keeps moving. Not a single order is issued by anybody that we can see in this. So it's all about the Romans as a machine. Perfect discipline. They're like robots. They just keep coming. They stay in formation. They don't need to be told what to do because it's all like clockwork. They just keep going. And they march on and they march on. And it's, again, it's a long scene, but it gives the time. It's a bit like Omar Sharif appearing in Lawrence of Arabia from, you know, not so much the little speck you have in that case, but particularly seeing us on the big screen. It's really impressive. It builds up the tension. They're coming, but they're coming slowly and steadily. They're not rushing towards you. And it is this intimidatingly silent, apart from the clash of, what's it, the thump of sword against hip or shield against the shoulder, this sort of thing, chink, 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 as they keep coming on. They're marching, they're in step. Now again, it's probably the advantage you actually had real soldiers, if, I'm guessing, conscripts doing their year or 2 years, whatever it was at the time, of national service, but they can actually march. They can actually keep formation pretty well. Better than you can expect from most extras who've just been rounded up, put on the back lot and given a few days practice. So it's pretty good. And they keep coming, but it is done entirely. The Romans don't issue any orders, they don't give any signals, they simply know what they're doing, and they march forward in this checkerboard, and when the first legion comes over the ridge, another one follows, or whether it's done, I'm not sure if that's actually you had that many extras, or whether it's a mirror of the one before. They keep going, Crassus keeps watching them, nobody says a thing. So for minutes of screen time, all we have is the noise of trumpets, a little bit of drum, and this as they keep going. Crassus watches. He's fairly wooden. He's not sort of smiling, he's not doing it, he's not reacting in any way, he's not encouraging them or telling them what to do. So Crassus's role in this battle is extraordinarily limited, but there's no sign of, while you see the standard bearers and you see people presumably supposed to be centurions or tribunes marching along beside or behind formations, they don't do anything. So they march forward in checkerboard, and they come close to the ridge where all the slaves are waiting, and they're still waiting. At this point, the Romans halt, and again, there's a little bit of a pause, and it is again, the tension continues to build. Then, once again, without any orders, the front two units spread out from the dense blocks they're in and form a shallow line of about, I think it's probably about 4 deep, maybe 3, maybe 4 deep. I should spend more time freeze framing this and trying to count them, but it's often a little bit difficult with the angle. And again, you can tell the purpose. They form a single line. Okay, so there have been various theories over the year, and maybe they'd come across some of this, that the maniples used to advance in checkerboard formation, but they'd actually, when they got close to the enemy, they would fill in the gaps. They'd form a solid line, because otherwise the enemy would run through the gaps. Now, I'm not so convinced by that, and that's something I'll talk about again when we get on to serious talks about Roman tactics. Then, rather strangely, the units behind all sort of rush together as well and form this big square. It's a solid square of, so you've got large thousands of people, of these soldiers all together. Now again, all of this has happened without anybody giving orders. And then the front line turns around, there's again nice sound effect as they move their shield, brace them to be in front of them, and they march forward. We won't go into too much detail about the equipment. Again, these are Hollywood Roman legionaries. They're not too far from many of the books, presentations of Roman legionaries that were around at the time. Before they realised that a lot of monuments used to have painted mail armour on, it was assumed that anyone with something smooth was leather. So they've got leather, that's sort of a bit of lorica segates. They've got rectangular shields, again, probably a bit early for those. These are more of a thing of the Principate. They seem to be mostly flat rather than curved, but that's probably, again, the ease of manufacturing them in such numbers. Because there are clearly quite a lot of, whilst obviously some extras further from the camera might not be as well equipped as others, they've still got a substantial number, given these prop weapons, armour and shields. And the helmets, okay, they look pretty Romanish, though again, not really for this period, they're a bit later. So it's more, you've got a sense of this is not so far from drawings that have been inspired partly by Trajan's Column and elsewhere of what a Roman legionary would look like. It's just that it's not right for this period. Shields should probably be oval, they should probably have mail, Montefortino, Coolus helmets, that sort of thing. Though again, we have to remember there are lots of details we don't really know about this period. So we're guessing, and we're probably blanketing everybody in the same way based on the evidence we have. They have pila, and the only time, however, you see these being thrown is in the engagement when the gladiators break out, and before that when Draba, the Woody Strode character, is trying to get at Crassus and the Romans, and he's pinned through the back with a pilum. They've got them, but again, this is another theme we'll return to, because the way this battle develops. So let's just talk about the formation a little bit more before we move on to the battle and the fighting that occurs. This is something where clearly someone has looked, they've read a bit about the Roman army, and they've decided to choreograph something that is inspired by that, but isn't really based on the best evidence, but also there are big problems. There are lots of question marks about just how it all worked, and my views are not shared by everybody, to say the least. So although I think, you know, my guesses for how this worked and how this was done, and it's something that I've written about in the non-fiction, obviously, but I've also tried to develop when I've written the novels to make the battles that occur as close to how I imagine these battles occurring as is possible. But it does involve, it's trying out a lot of ideas. You know, you get to do that when you write and say, well, okay, does this work? They had to do something that would work. They had to do something that was impressive on cinema. So they've created this choreographed thing that's a bit more Busby Berkeley perhaps than Battlefield, and is very impressive. But like a lot of things in movies, it doesn't necessarily, you know, make much sense. You know, let's take a recent example. 1917 is a good film, but it's a little bit odd when these two blokes have struggled to get through the abandoned front lines that the survivor meets a load of people in trucks who are able to drive to where he's going, or take him part of the way. You know, it does rather defeat the logic of the whole film, and the premise of the plot does seem rather thin at this point when, you know, couldn't you just hail a cab and drive there effectively? But anyway, it makes enough, presumably, if you're not coming from the historian's perspective, you're not interested in the Romans, it looks impressive. And the message it gives is, back with the slave army, you have a whole load of individuals who are working together, who've come together to fight for their freedom, and they're doing it out of natural desire to be free, not to be oppressed, not to be slaves. And the women are fighting, the old are fighting. These are not soldiers, but everybody is desperate because the cause is such a good and obvious one. And they are opposed by machine-like oppressors. You know, the Roman soldiers don't get any personality whatsoever. They don't need any command. You simply crank up the clockwork, point them towards the enemy, and off they go. And they do these slightly bizarre drills on the way. But it is, again, it's impressive. And that it is done by extras and not by CGI adds to that impressiveness. You know, it is a great scene, and it gives this image, and this is an image that you will often get, and it's still there for many scholars, the idea that Roman army discipline is so rigid that, you know, nobody does anything out of turn. And that can be extended into the idea that is there in the novel, that when you drill people and discipline them so much, you make them too rigid to react to changed circumstances. Now, to some extent, you know, historians like Josephus will talk about that and claim that's a weakness of the Roman army. Again, I think a lot of these things are exaggerated, and you can't push. Yes, all armies have to be, to some extent, machine-like, because you're getting large numbers of people to work together and combine, particularly as armies get more sophisticated, different types of weapons, different types of specializations, together to be as effective as possible. But they're still all human beings, and they make mistakes, and they need to be reminded and told what to do. They need to be inspired what to do. So that's not there. These are simply automata who march towards the enemy with you know, sounds that are almost inhuman as well. There's nothing. There's no cheers. There's no orders. There's no, you know, encouragement, anything like that. They don't need that because they're just clockwork and they're going towards the slaves. So we come to the battle itself. We won't talk quite so much about this, but you have features that we will come back to again and again and again. That thin line, the Roman front line of 3 or 4 deep, advances towards the slaves. They have their pila, but they're using them at spears. And it's one thing, I've never seen a movie or a TV production that's actually had a formation of Roman troops throwing pila and seeing the pila punching through shields, going into people, this sort of thing. I think it would be great cinema. It was visually very powerful, but hasn't been done yet. And maybe it's harder to do, but you'd think it would be possible, given how fond they are of peppering everybody with arrows. You think you could do it with pila. Still, they don't do that. They just march towards the slaves. The slaves finally, at a signal from Kirk Douglas, they produce these logs that are blazing material around them. So fire. Fire is something we will come back to again and again in cinematic battles. Directors love it. It gives colour, excitement to ancient battles. Problem is, evidence-wise, this is not something that we really see people using, and practically you have to wonder how is this supposed to work. You do get a few accounts not in this conflict, but in others, of defenders rolling down boulders or wagons full of boulders down a slope against attackers. So it's not entirely beyond the reach of imagination, but they're not usually on fire or anything like that. Anyway, the fire comes down, the Romans, they break, they run away. can't blame them as he's come towards them. So the formation breaks up. Kirk Douglas and his boys, or at least Kirk Douglas sends most of the slaves, charge down, and this is when you get that first roar, that great cheer of the slave army attacking, and that's where you get the human noise comes into the battle. And the Romans some of them are run over and burned, some of them are caught and hacked down, some of them get away, they're dropping shields, some of them try to make a barrier of shields and stop one of the blazing logs. Doesn't work, doesn't go well for them. You then develop into the classic on-screen battle, because from this point on, there are no formations. And the Romans are a crowd, and the slaves are a crowd. And they're a very loose crowd. The slaves have been packed quite close together while they were waiting. The Romans were relatively open formation, but, still a clear formation. Now, everybody intertwines. And what you get are lots and lots of individual duels. Some of them, looking at it more closely when I was rewatching it before I did this talk, some of the fighting in the background looks fairly tentative, and you wonder if these are, army conscripts and others who are, going through the motions, doing what they're told, but a bit fed up, as soldiers often are, and not going into it. And others are probably going for it with all gusto because it's a break from the monotony. But there are some, good scenes, and then whilst this is going on, the fighting is developed. There's no real pattern to it, but men and people are being killed on either side. But that's the pattern. Individual duels, or perhaps 1 against 2 against 3, 2 against 3. They're very small groups. No formations, no real coordination, and the enemy might just as well be behind you as around you. You're all intermingled. You very quickly become this sort of scattered lots of dots of different colours that are all fighting each other. Laurence Olivier then gets to say the only thing, and his only really reaction in this whole scene, when you suddenly have cheering again, but this time Roman cheering, as I suspect the same extras but depicted running forward in their big formations appeared, and some cavalry or horsemen galloping as well. Somebody said Pompey and Lucullus, so the other Roman armies have arrived. So we now know Kirk Douglas and his boys are doomed because they're outnumbered, they're surrounded. Kirk Douglas reacts to it by just charging on horseback down into this mass, kills a few while he's on horseback, his horse gets taken down. Again, good dramatic stuff, good stuntman stuff, but it's, again, very open battlefield. There's loads of space for everybody to go around and move around and pick your opponent. And nobody runs away, and nobody gets wounded. You die or you survive in these fights. They always end in the death. So they're like gladiatorial fights, but waged on a huge battlefield. You've got one of the restored pieces where Kirk Douglas lops an arm off a legionary. Crixus gets killed. The battle develops, but you don't actually see how it's resolved. You move then to the aftermath, the field of corpses. Nobody seems to be wounded on either side. Again, they're all dead. And then, of course, we have one of the greatest scenes in the film, one of the most memorable in Hollywood, when the I'm Spartacus scene, when the Romans are calling out that the slaves should give over to them Spartacus and their lives will be spared. And as Kirk Douglas stands up, Tony Curtis does at the same time and yells out, "I'm Spartacus," and then the others all do it. And it's wonderful cinema, and it's very inspiring, and it's something you can usually in a gathering of a suitable number of people, if one of you shouts out, "I'm Spartacus," you can be sure that several others will repeat that quite quickly. It sticks in the mind. It's great. It's not history. It's not in the novel either, but it's great cinema. And I don't think you can do anything than just say this is good stuff. So the battle is all about machine-like Romans up until the point where the fighting starts, when it just becomes lots of individual duels. But there's no command and control, there's no real tactics beyond that approach, and even that seems slightly futile because they've come in this formation and they change into a sort of big defensive block, but then you don't see that big block again. You don't know what happens to it. Now, whether, again, you never know whether there were shots that showed them breaking up or that showed some reaction and that those were discarded and ended up on the cutting room floor. There is a simple narrative to the battle, and because you know that the Romans have got these extra armies coming, and you know that you've probably worked out by this time the film must be heading towards its end, Spartacus is going to lose. So there's a sense, if you come with no real sort of military sense or historical sense, you can probably follow this and understand what's going on. It's a dramatic battle, and the slaves are doomed but heroic, which is the message that the film wants, so fair enough. Again, you get, subsequently, it's the Romans that steal the scene and steal the show for a long time. Partly because it's the Romans that are then get involved. You know, Peter Ustinov gets flogged out of the camp. Crassus gets smitten by Varinia, by Gene Simmons, and you know, it's again, that's something that does happen in the book in a slightly different way. And Gracchus steals her away and gets her to safety. Not with Batiatus, because he's been murdered by this time. So it echoes of it, and it's only really there in the latter stages of the book that you get the sense of Crassus, the financier, the investor, the money man, and his various enterprises, which is quite nice. And again, I can see how, you know, you've got to be careful with a story not to flood too much information and detail at any point. So from a story point of view, I can understand why it's done that way. You don't really get that so much in the film. It's more about Crassus the general and the ambitious politician who's taking over. And you have this sort of coup almost that occurs at the end, where he starts executing all his political opponents, and he wants to keep Gracchus as a sort of a token mouthpiece to come into the Senate now and again and just, you know, say how great Crassus and his new regime is. None of this is historical, you know, it's anticipating. To some extent, Crassus had been involved with this when he'd served as one of Sulla's commanders, so he has done this, he has executed his opponents, or at least been involved with the side that's doing that back in the past, and has benefited from property confiscated from the proscribed. But he won't be around for the later civil wars. It's not what he does in 70. So it's, you know, it's a dramatic culmination to the film. In the novel, Gracchus steals Varinia away, has this knight talking to her and feeling that he's understanding. And he then becomes quite a sympathetic character because, yes, he's been a Roman, yes, he's been a slave owner, but he frees his own slaves, and then because he knows Crassus is going to be angry with him for stealing this woman, kills himself for that reason rather than for political reasons. So maybe the film is more powerful, but it's similar to the fictional source material it's using. Again, not really what Roman politics is like at this time, though of course that threat of violence and revolution underplays all of these years, and we sometimes forget, because Cicero gives us this sense of normality, just how dangerous these times were, and that everybody's lived through that first civil war, so they know it, you know, maybe this could happen again. So we come to the end of what's still an enjoyable film. Many of these epics, sometimes the pacing can go a bit, you know, when they are as long as this, it's quite a long watch. I remember when I saw it in the cinema being very relieved they'd put the interval back in, just to give you a moment to stretch your legs and do the necessary. And I felt that the Napoleon film could have done with that, because I certainly needed it. But maybe that's just, you know, middle age advancing, and that's what I can't do these days. But I do quite like the epic in terms of length, in terms of scale, of letting a story develop more gradually. Some modern films can be too fast. On the other hand, it can work. It depends. In the end, it comes down to how well you tell the story. Spartacus is probably not the greatest film ever made, but I think it's still a decent film. It evokes the past. Historically, lots of license, lots we don't know, lots of invention, lots of things we do know that they haven't quite got right. They've gone another way. Some of it explicable because at the time they were doing it, this probably would have been how people were saying, well, this is what, you know, the Roman army should look like. And of course, each generation sees echoes of itself, or how you feel a society might be based on your own preoccupations in the past. And this was very much a film of its time, as anyone will be. But it stands up. You know, we're 63 years on from when it was made, and it's still well worth a watch. And it is still frequently shown on TV. And, you know, I've got it on DVD and on Blu-ray. And each time I see, particularly that battle scene, it's impressive. It's a darn good bit of cinema. So I think that's enough for today, because there isn't really much more to say than that, other than, as I say, remember some of these themes we've talked about in this battle, because when we come and look at other cinematic and on-screen battles showing the Romans, but also other armies as well, many of the same features will come in. And particularly in films like this that are not primarily about this battle or even the battles in general, their interest is in the heroics, slaves and gladiators who escape and challenge the almighty Roman Republic. That they can't really win is something we all understand, but it's the struggle that they tried is the thing that is inspiring. And again, it's not supported by any, we don't, this idea of Verinia being, but she and Kirk Douglas, Gene Simmons and Kirk Douglas, almost, it comes to life, ironically enough, in those last few moments, the last scenes they have. So again, apparently there were a couple of different versions of that shot and how it was done. But as Peter Ustinov is taking Verinia to safety and sneaking them out past Crassus's guards, there is Kirk Douglas on the cross next to he's the last of the slaves, and then you've got right to the horizon all these other crosses with slaves on them, all dying slow, terrible deaths, with Gene Simmons rushing over to him, even though Peter Ustinov is panicking, thinking they'll get discovered, they'll get arrested, and, begging her husband, begging the man she loves most of all, showing him his son, but also, and saying, he's free, Spartacus, he's free, begging him to die, don't finally give up. One of the themes of the novel in particular, and it's there to an extent in the film, is this emphasis on, for Spartacus, success as a slave is living, keeping on, staying alive. That way you don't give in, you don't quit, you don't let them make you despair, you just keep living. That's the only real victory you can have. And to live freely, that's, even better. You've managed that for a few years. So it's powerful, it's a very dramatic, it's again a very memorable scene. It's pretty grim, but that's the nature of the story. And I think that's one of the problems, one of the reasons the slaves don't come to life too often, is that it's always the balancing act. When you're dealing with a subject matter that is so grim, you need those elements of relief. So that it's good in the gladiatorial school, but that's before they've broken out, and that's exciting. That's the thing. But it's almost a little bit flat while the slave army is marauding around Italy. And I'm not sure in the final cut they have, or the later one, Tony Curtis's Antoninus doesn't get to do a lot, and even Kirk Douglas doesn't get to do a lot much more than be the sort of the heroic leader. And he does that very well, but it's harder to get to know the man. But there again, if you'd had him talking about all these other things, which you get a little bit of in the novel, would have slowed everything down. So there's an aspect of the film that doesn't quite work, but I'm not sure how you could have done that another way. It's rather like, think of a film like Schindler's List. You make a film about the Holocaust where statistically the probability is most people in the camps are not going to survive. It may be historically accurate, but it's so grim, it's so hard to watch. Whereas you can have some of that. You can see that appalling, the brutality, both the sort of the more direct, people being shot down, this sort of thing, but also the gas chambers and the clinical industrial slaughter. It helps that some people get away. Some of our characters get away, and you've got somebody trying to do the right thing. With the story of Spartacus, you have a little bit of that where Verinia helps to do that, and that both Gracchus and Batiatus sort of see the light in a sense and realise that maybe they've been doing bad things, and that the Rome that Crassus is creating is terrible and all this sort of thing. And they help Verinia and her baby to escape. So you get a little bit of that, but it's much harder to do. So I think there are problems that would always be difficult, and it's just a very hard story to tell, even though it's a fascinating and inspiring story. But there's a grimness about it. There's a grimness underlying it. If you're going to face up to the reality of mass slavery and then taking slaves and making them fight and die for your entertainment, that's quite a hard subject to deal with. But again, we'll come back to this theme in other talks. Gladiators obsess Hollywood because they are, in a sense, good box office, because there's an inherent drama in people who have to fight to the death. So it's not only been used in Roman context, but those sorts of ideas come up again and again and again. But there is sometimes a feeling that sort of all roads in the Roman Empire lead to the arena rather than all roads lead to Rome, because the number of films where gladiators appear is overrepresentative of their importance in the Roman world. But I still think it's a good film. I'm sure I'd be amazed if anybody watching this has not seen the film already. But if you haven't watched it for a few years, sit down and treat yourself when you've got some time and watch it again, because there's a lot that's good about it, even if there's a lot that's not so very accurate, has a lot of license, even though most of the story is obviously fictional because we don't know anything much about these people, and the Roman characters are I don't think Crassus gets a fair shake, but I think Crassus as an adversary for Spartacus, has to do different things in the story, and you don't get to see the Crassus, the political operator, in quite the same way, and Crassus, the businessman. I'll talk about this when we come to that series, but it's a great shame the HBO Rome series didn't start a decade or so earlier, in my view, because I think when you had Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar all in Rome, and you still had Clodius and Milo and these people coming along, and Catiline and other, there was great material that they could have done on the budget they had. And instead they moved on to what they considered the famous bits, and I think that was a little bit of a shame. Anyway, I'm not supposed to be talking about that, I was supposed to be talking about Spartacus, but that's it for today.